Today we're going to study the emergence of sonata form during the Baroque period. Around the end of the 17th century and near the beginning of the 18th century, sonata form emerged as a prominent genre, first in Italy and then it spread to Germany and France and England. At that time, there were essentially sonatas and trio sonatas. The trio sonata had a pleasing sound given its texture consisting of three different lines. In fact, very often, although there were three lines which were played at the same time, there were often four different instruments that outlined this texture. So the high instruments were usually the violins, the flutes, or the oboes, and they would occupy the two upper lines of the music, and the lower two lines made up the basso continuo, one layer of which was often played by keyboard instruments such as the organ or the harpsichord, and the other basso continuo instrument was often a bassoon or a cello or some such bass instrument. So that was the trio sonata. Now around 1660, by that stage, sonata form had taken essentially two forms. There was the sonata da chiesa and the sonata da camera. Now the sonata da chiesa was essentially a church style of sonata suitable for serious occasions, religious music. The sonata da camera was a slightly lighter style of music. Often it consisted of dance movements. It might have begun with a prelude. So that was the sonata da camera. One of the prolific composers of this time was Arcangelo Corelli. Corelli was a great composer of string music, and string music had become a prominent genre around this period in the Baroque. Corelli was a trailblazer. He established a new modern technique of violin playing. He started out in Bologna, in Italy, and then later on he worked in Rome. In 1660 he began his studies in Bologna, and by 1675 he had moved on to Rome. So he gained an education in various places in Italy. He was already an established violinist, a teacher, a composer, and he was in fact one of the leading composers of string music at the time. Less than 90 of his compositions survive, and yet he was one of the most highly regarded of composers for string music. He was one of the greatest violinists of the time. So this was Arcangelo Corelli. Now, interestingly, in his style of trio sonata, he favored lyricism over virtuosity. He cared more about the lyrical quality of the melodies. He didn't just succumb to the temptation to show off with virtuosic composition and playing. So that was in fact one of the good features of his trio sonatas. And he left 60 sonatas, solo sonatas in general, and there were another 12 concerti. He wrote prolifically in the genre of concerto grosso. He wrote pretty much only instrumental music. He didn't leave any vocal music. There are certain qualities which underpin his particular style of composition. A notable feature is his use of a walking bass with quavers above that, and he would often superimpose violins over a descending sequence in the basses. The violins tended to interact in a dialogue. These were novel features of Corelli's compositional style. He enjoyed the patronage of important people at the time. Queen Christina of Sweden was a loyal supporter of his, and he was supported by other wealthy patrons. We're going to look at the music of Corelli in more detail. We're going to examine one of his trio sonatas. He should be credited not only for establishing a modern violin technique and for laying the groundwork for a new style of playing in the 18th century, but he also established the norms and standards of form and style and performance at that time, he set new standards of performance. He improved the standard of performance. He, in fact, led one of the first orchestras ever in Italy. So and we can say he was truly a trailblazer in every sense. He really established the violin as a more significant instrument. He established the sonata as a key genre of the Baroque. It had emerged around his time, and he really cemented the genre, both the sonata and the trio sonata. And we're going to examine in more detail one of his trio sonatas, the one in A minor, and we're going to look at it in more detail. Arcangelo Corelli was the most prominent Italian violinist and composer of string music around 1700. He was also a respected teacher who laid the foundations of modern violin technique. He was born into a wealthy family in Fusinano, a small town in northern Italy. He studied the violin and composition in Bologna starting in 1666. By 1675, he had moved to Rome. He became a leading violinist, teacher, and composer, and enjoyed the support of Queen Christina of Sweden and other wealthy patrons. Corelli wrote only instrumental music, and fewer than 90 of his compositions survive. Almost all of these works were in three genres: trio sonata, solo violin sonata, and concerto grosso. He left behind 60 sonatas and 12 concertos, all for strings. He published his sonatas in sets of 12, assigning an opus number to each set. His trio and solo sonatas represent the crowning achievement in Italian chamber music of the late 17th century. In his trio sonatas, he emphasized lyricism over virtuosity. Typical features of his style were a walking bass with moving quavers, chains of suspensions in the violins above, and a descending sequence in the bass and dialogue between the violins. He had a strong influence on both performers and composers and helped to raise performance standards to a new level. He organized and led one of the first orchestras in Italy. He established standards of form and style. He laid the foundations for 18th century schools of violin playing and ultimately pioneered the modern violin technique. Corelli's trio sonata in A minor is written for two violins and basso continuo. The violins play the two upper lines. The basso continuo is played by an organ, cello, or theorbo, which is a bass lute. The basso continuo is more than an accompaniment. It plays an active role in the texture of the music. This work has 4 short movements. Each has a different meter, mood, and tempo. As mentioned, uniformity of mood in each movement or piece was a characteristic feature of Baroque instrumental music. Here you can hear the opening theme of movement 1. This movement is in common meter and uses dotted rhythms. It is played twice and has a half cadence on the dominant at the end, creating a sense of anticipation. Here you can hear the half cadence on the dominant at the end. Here you can hear the opening of movement 2, which begins with a repeated note motif. The subject is introduced by the first violin and imitated by the second violin and cello, doubled by the organ. This is an allegro movement with a common time meter, which is fugue-like. A fugal second movement is characteristic of Baroque trio sonatas. Like the first movement, this movement ends with a half cadence on the dominant. Here you can hear the beginning of movement 3, which opens with a descending leap in the first violin. This is imitated a tone higher by the second violin. The oboe serves as the basso continuo and provides differing tone colors. This movement is a soulful adagio in triple meter. Here you can hear the beginning of movement 4. This movement is a dance like allegro in quadruple meter, with each beat subdivided into 3. The movement is in binary form, A, A, B, B. Each section is repeated. Section B is 3 times longer than section A. At the end of section B, there is the only dynamic change in the sonata. The concluding phrase is repeated softly as an echo.